But I really think that I need to give you as much information as I can to prepare you for these next stages of your career, because those are really the most important parts, the longest parts, the parts where you'll invest the most of yourself, your time, your family, your resources, all of those things. So just to clean up a couple things, I used to work at GW. I taught there as principal faculty. I'm not there anymore, so I just wanted to clarify that point if it wasn't clear in the intro. I do work in critical care medicine now. I'm the clinical editor of JAAPA. I've had a bunch of different roles at JAAPA, so it's really confusing to try to zero that in. But the reason I bring up all of that is that I've kind of been where you are. I've been in that educational environment before, and I've really spent a lot of time thinking and writing about a lot of these topics too, and putting your thoughts out there is something that, you kind of have to kind of believe in what you say if you're going to put it in writing. And so you can kind of look back and see the evolution of some of my thoughts over the last 10 years. And that's sort of the risk of being a writer. But it's given me a lot of time to dig into some literature, some evidence, and I hope to bring a little bit of that to you today. But I want this to be a practical talk as well. All right, so first and foremost, I know this is a conference on burnout. You should know I often try to color outside of the lines. I am not often sticking to the script, and that's the case today as well. I won't say famously because it's not that well known, but I notoriously wrote this editorial a few years ago after we started publishing a lot more burnout literature in JAAPA. And basically, I don't love the term burnout. I respect the research that's been done on it, don't get me wrong, but often I'm afraid that when we say burnout, we're often talking about a problem with an individual. And based on my last 10 years in healthcare and in all of the research I've done in healthcare, I think that the environment itself is often the bigger problem than the individual. We select for these awesome, resilient people. We put you through the ringer, both in the application process and in the training process. And then we throw you into an environment and tell you to, get better, toughen up, just be resilient and don't burn out. The fact is that burnout is a problem with not just us, but our environment. And also, it's a really broad term. As you heard in that first talk today, it overlaps with a lot of other things like depression. I don't like to have too many broad, all-encompassing terms that take away from the details of what we're talking about, which makes it harder to dig down to the factors that contribute and to ultimately finding solutions. Now, you can imagine writing an editorial like this in response to research conducted by some of the profession's most respected researchers earned me a little bit of blowback. And so they also wrote an editorial or a letter to the editor, basically saying, let's not go so far. We really need this burnout research. And that's pretty much the closest we ever get to academic clapbacks. But it's all in good fun. I really respect those people. And I really like the fact that I'm able to speak at conferences and talk about different ideas like this, because I think that's what's awesome about academic discourse, especially when it's done respectfully. Okay, so what are we actually going to talk about today? I want to talk to you about the intersection of three concepts. And I know that makes this a pretty focused and kind of laser sharp topic, but I think that's what we need given the constraints of the time slot, et cetera. But what we're going to talk about is the intersection of toxic behavior itself in the healthcare setting, how that plays into burnout, and what diversity has to do with all of these things. I really hope to hit the bullseye between these three, but they all do relate to each other, both individually and in pairs and as a trio of topics. Okay, so let's start with toxic behavior. I think that's the part that I've been speaking about the longest and something that I care a lot about. So I'm going to give you a really abbreviated version of this. But first and foremost, before we even get into any of this stuff, what is toxic behavior? We need to at least understand what we're talking about so we're all on the same page there. There are really two categories of toxic behavior. You could throw them into two big buckets. You can say there's overt toxic behavior and there is subtle toxic behavior. The overt stuff is stuff that you could see with your eyeballs from a distance or hear with your earballs from a distance. These are like insults, degrading comments, yelling, throwing things, the very demonstrative stuff that you think about when someone's losing it. But they could also be things like malicious rumors, a little more finessed, refusing to work with colleagues, the cold shoulder, that kind of stuff. And then, of course, you get into the more egregious things like sexual harassment and sexual assault and misconduct. Now, those are easy to see, and because they're easy to see, they're easy to report and sometimes give consequences for. So oftentimes toxic people get a little bit smarter and have more subtle behavior. These are the passive aggressive things that you can't really put in writing and say, look, this person was attacking me, but you know the tone, you know the intent, it's malicious. The professional slander, people degrading your care or your work, not being constructive in their criticism, but weaponizing feedback in ways to harm you. We don't talk about it much, but degrading your patients is extremely toxic to providers. Their appearance, their weight, their health, their social circumstances. When I hear that about my patients, it certainly affects my well-being, and certainly affects often the care of those patients as well. And then we have even more subtle stuff like coded language, coded sexism, coded racism. I don't like to have a definition of toxic behavior, because if I give you a strict definition, people can work around it. They can find loopholes. They can say, look, I didn't meet the definition of toxic behavior. I don't like that. I want you to be able to say, you know it when you see it. If it's toxic, it's toxic. And often the rule of thumb you could say is like, look, if the intent was malicious, it's toxic. If the intent was innocent and somebody screwed up and it hurt someone's feelings, that's okay. That's not really what we're talking about. But if the intent was malicious, that's really what we care about here. Okay, so how prevalent is this stuff? If it was a disease, I would talk to you about incidence and prevalence. You've probably heard a lot about that in your lectures. And the numbers will vary, but there's a lot of big surveys on this. The numbers that I grabbed for this slide actually came from a survey of healthcare executives. And if you've worked in any healthcare job, you probably know, and I'll get in trouble for saying this, I guess, but healthcare executives are often the most out of touch with the frontline worker. So if they're saying that this is very prevalent, like, holy cow, it must have reached all the way up into the C-suite or the ivory tower, wherever they happen to be. But these are the breakdowns. So 98% say, yeah, they experience toxic behavior on a yearly basis, at least once a year, annually. So pretty much everyone, right? About 30% on a weekly basis, which is a lot. You're almost at a third here every week. And then 10% of healthcare workers say that they experience toxic behavior on a daily basis. So you can imagine in an ICU or in a large clinic or in an OR suite, you could probably find one person who's experiencing toxic behavior every single day. It's extremely caustic, and I'll show you how. Just some other things to think about as well. Some of these things like malicious rumors are not the most harmful thing we can do. There's much more egregious things out there that do happen regularly in our work environments. I think it's worth acknowledging. This was a Medscape survey back in 2018 that looked at sexual harassment of PAs, NPs, and nurses. They threw us all into one big bucket there. I don't know why. I guess Medscape is still trying to learn the nuance of our professions, but I'm glad they did this research, because 11% said they experienced sexual abuse, sexual harassment, or sexual misconduct. That's a lot. But another 14% said they witnessed sexual abuse, sexual harassment, and sexual misconduct. I highlight this because of an important fact you need to know. The targets of harassment or toxic behavior suffer severe consequences of it. But those witnessing toxic behavior suffer similar consequences as well. So it's not like a sniper's bullet coming in and hitting the target. It's really like rolling a grenade into a workplace. It hurts everyone around the target as well. And you probably know, or at least suspect, that there's even more heinous and egregious things that happen in healthcare workplaces. And unfortunately, they are often protected, ignored, or covered up by powerful institutions. So these are just 3 instances of really extreme violations, heinous acts, up to and including actual rape of coworkers, and rape of patients that happen at often high-profile hospitals. These are covered by reputable journalism outfits, and are also often in court filings as well. So I will say these are allegations. This is all alleged. I shouldn't say that these are facts, but reputable sources have pointed out major instances where there's been extreme hostility in the workplace, and it's often either ignored, covered up, or even abetted by some of these more powerful institutions. So it's a huge problem in healthcare is what I'm getting at, and we're up against a lot if we care about combating toxic behavior in our healthcare workplaces. Okay, so what happens? I normally do like a whole hour-long talk on this, so I'll just give you the short version and focus it in on what happens to clinicians. But clinicians who are subjected to toxic behavior really suffer, and they suffer in a lot of different ways. They have increased rates of anxiety and depression. So there's an association between experiencing toxic behavior and reporting anxiety and depression rates, which are already higher in the healthcare workforce than the average population. They experience increased emotional distress and, oh, there's that term that I love, burnout. But it's good to think about burnout. Those three criteria we talked about in this first talk, even if they overlap with depression, even if they overlap with emotional distress, it's important indicators to see. So the fact that they suffer more burnout is important, and we should look at that. And then there was one study that showed that people who are subject to toxic behavior have increased use of sedatives and sleep aids. That's important to me because you may also know that healthcare workers have increased use of alcohol and other substances, illicit substances, compared to the general population. And we're not really protected as we should be by our education and our income, which are usually health protective factors. So if you imagine that people using sedatives and sleep aids are probably also self-medicating in other ways, and those are extremely harmful. Some of the other talks, the first talk today talked about some of those really dire consequences of mental health problems among healthcare workers. And certainly I don't have data to show the relationship between toxic behavior and self-harm, but I have to imagine there is one given these other relationships as well. And then there's a whole discussion we could have about resignation. Some of the research that I did or published last year talked about turnover in the healthcare workforce, but really absenteeism and resignations. Absenteeism means you just trying to get the heck out of work any way you can, whether that's calling in sick, whether that's taking vacation days when you normally wouldn't take vacation there, whether that's showing up late, hiding in the bathroom, avoiding your tasks, whatever it happens to be. It hurts you as a professional, and it also hurts your institutions. So it's really important. And then the ultimate form of that is just voting with your feet, just resigning, walking out the door. That is harmful to organizations too. It costs them money, but it's also a bump in the road for you. It probably injects a lot of stress into your life. It may feel like a career setback, even though I promise you it's not. As the guy who's had 5 different hospital jobs in 10 years, you'll do just fine. But it does inject stress into your life, and it also disrupts the workplace. So we care about those type of things as well. All right, and I will say this, I have a lot I could talk about the effects on patients, but I've been talking a lot about associations and relationships because I can't show you a randomized controlled trial of beating up a healthcare worker and then measuring their level of depression afterwards. That would be completely unethical. But there are randomized controlled trials in simulation environments in which the researchers had a simulated crisis, like in this study, a neonatal resuscitation, and they did put a rude, passive-aggressive person on the team in the treatment group versus the control group, and found that the performance in every single area of care dropped when that toxic person was put on the team. That's diagnosis, that's procedural skills, that's recognizing and reporting errors. So you can imagine, even though these were simulations and you can't measure mortality in a little robot baby, that if this happens in the real world and your performance drops across the board in the most high stakes resuscitation situations, we are probably also harming patients by being rude and toxic to each other. So I just want to keep that as a firm fixed point in your mind, because these were really well-designed studies that are pretty convincing that performance is heavily affected by even passive aggressive, subtle toxic behavior. Okay, before we move on to the next phase of this, I want to touch on one of the mechanical parts of toxic behavior because it plays into the rest of this entire talk. So there's something you need to know about called power gradients. Power gradients are any difference in the influence, resources, or power between two individuals or two groups of individuals. Basically, if someone has more or less power than you, there's a different dynamic between those people. It's kind of common sense. And frankly, we're okay with some of these relationships. Some of these relationships we accept in everyday life, like employer-employee. I accept that my boss is going to have some say over what I do when I walk in every day. I accept that there are certain things I can't say to them or certain ways I can't talk to them. And that's okay. We've, as a society, agreed on that. But there are less formal relationships that have similar dynamics as well. Even traditional relationships in healthcare, where you think of the traditional like doctor and nurse relationship, where the doctors are usually not employing nurses in most major healthcare systems now, but there's a hierarchy there because of the traditional influence and prestige of one versus the other, maybe even training and income. There's a lot of differences where we often will elevate someone like a physician above someone like a nurse or a PA for that matter. And there's not really a formal reason to do that other than culture. And then there's all kinds of other power gradients that crisscross and don't really have any one direction, or they're not unilateral. So for instance, if you look in the UK and you ask interns in the UK, first year physicians in the UK, hey, who bullies you the most? They will say, and this is based on research that's been done in the UK, they'll say physicians, attending physicians are the most likely to bully me. But you ask them who's the second most likely, and they say nurses. And that's interesting because it goes against that traditional power gradient I just told you about. But there are other power gradients at play. Think about it. A nurse has other power, right? They may have social capital. There's a lot of nurses and they tend to be popular with one another. They may have experience where that intern is coming and doesn't know the system, is not comfortable, is not confident. An experienced person would be. They have social numbers. They may have other factors going on as well. So there are some power gradients that can overlap and overpower each other and can get pretty complicated and dynamic. Power gradients can also be protective and or weaponized. So if you ask those same healthcare executives from that earlier study I mentioned, who gets fired for unprofessional behavior? So you ask them all, hey, have you ever seen a nurse get fired for unprofessional behavior? 61% of them will say, yes, I have. You ask those same executives, have you ever seen a physician get fired for unprofessional behavior? And only 22% of them will say yes. And that's with the exact same rates of toxic behavior being perpetrated amongst these two groups. So nurses and physicians, is what I'm saying, is are equally toxic if you look at the survey data, but one group is being punished at a much higher rate than the other. And it's probably because of some of those power gradients. Now, you think why that might be? Well, yeah, I talked about physicians being this like influential and prestigious title and nurses not being as influential and as prestigious, but there's other things as well. Physicians are more male dominated, so there may be a gender power dynamic there. Nursing professions across the world tend to be more ethnically and racially diverse, so there may be some of that at play. There's a lot that goes into these. These are complex dynamics, but we need to acknowledge and understand them if we're going to address things like toxic behavior and our own well-being. Okay, woo, I'll give you a lot there. It was like a whirlwind, but we need to take a quick detour into some diversity stuff because I told you I was going to try to hit the intersection of all of this. So just to give you a second to catch your breath, I hope I've convinced you that toxic behavior exists. It's pretty prevalent in healthcare and it's pretty detrimental to our well-being. Let's take a little bit of a detour into some diversity stuff. Okay, why do I even want to talk to you about diversity? Well, I could do the whole hour, and I don't even have an hour, but I could do a whole hour on diversity if we really wanted to. And I'll just highlight a couple of reasons why I care about this. So first and foremost, the PA profession itself is super important. It's an excellent job that's well paid, that has job security, that gives you awesome training, that puts you in demand, that gives you status in your community and in the world. The PA profession can change lives if you lack any of those things. If you're of a low socioeconomic status, if you are from a family that doesn't traditionally have higher education, if you have anything working against you, the PA profession has the ability to pull an individual out of poverty and put them in a course to build generational wealth and change the entire course of their families, which can change the entire course of communities. This is a super powerful tool that we could use a lot more to fix some of the problems in our society. And one of the reasons that I care about getting people, a diverse group of people, into the PA profession. But why else does diversity matter, specifically in healthcare? Well, one thing you need to know is that there's plenty of research that shows that teams that are very diverse have better performance and better outcomes in the healthcare environment. So your team is diverse, it does better. Pretty straightforward. But you also need to know that diversity affects health outcomes directly. So you may know that certain health outcomes in this country are worse for certain groups of people. For instance, Black mothers have much higher rates of maternal mortality than white mothers. So that's a straight up fact. But you may not know that when you start matching physicians with patients based on their race and obtain something called racial concordance, which basically just means the same race of the clinician and their patient, you start to see these disparities drop. Meaning if that same Black mother has a Black physician, then her outcomes will be better than if she had a white physician. That is straight up evidence of racism and racial bias in healthcare. There's really only one explanation for that, and that's that racism kills people. So these are really important things. And beyond just the nitty-gritty of the data behind it, I think we lose track of the fact that we have a moral imperative to support justice and equity. What I mean is, even beyond those studies, even beyond showing that we can adjust mortality and fix financial discrepancies, we have a moral imperative to improve our society, to improve humanity. And this is something that means that we have to do this even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs money, even when it's something we don't feel like doing at any given moment. So I just want us to move forward understanding that there are a lot of great data on it, but at the end of the day, the reason we care about these things is because they are the right thing to do. Okay, so how's the PA profession doing when it comes to diversity? Well, the answer is not great, Bob. So we often make this more complicated than it has to be. I think we're sometimes a little bit afraid to talk about this topic, but the truth is that you can show representation pretty easily. What you need to know is, how does the group that I care about look, meaning the United States, the population of our country, and how does that translate to the subgroup that I care about, like the PA profession? If they are equal, then there are no barriers. That means that we are perfectly sampling our society into our profession. But that's not what we see when we look at the PA profession. So in 3 groups in particular, we see the percentage makeup of the US population not represented in the PA profession. So for instance, when it comes to Black or African American individuals, we see the US population is between 12 and 13%, but the PA profession is between 3 and 4%. So a major drop off. And you see the same thing in Native American or Alaska Native Indigenous peoples in this country, where they make up about 0.8% of the US population, but only about 0.4% of the PA profession. And then you see Hispanic or Latino people who are in all of our data sources separated from race, which you can kind of debate the semantics and the whether that's right or not, but I go with the data that I have. 16 to 17% of the people in the United States called or refer to themselves or consider themselves Hispanic or Latino, and it's far less, between 6 and 7% in the PA profession. So I was getting lazy when I made this, and I pulled data from 2019 because I've given this talk before, and PAEA didn't update their data since 2020. So I figured I'm going to just be lazy. But then I thought, no, I care about this conference. I'm going to give you all the best data I can. So I found the 2022 AAPA data. And here we are 2 years after the death of George Floyd. Where do we stand? Unfortunately, still not great, Bob. So I just updated the specific numbers in these 3 groups. And now this is not apples to apples comparisons. They're 2 different groups doing 2 different surveys. I didn't do any statistical analysis to show you whether or not this is due to chance or not. But the raw numbers are even lower than they were back in 2019. So 3% of the profession is Black or African American, according to AAPA, 0.4% is Indigenous, and then 6% responded as Hispanic or Latino. So that is not a scientific way of showing a trend in the wrong direction, but it certainly wasn't this groundswell of improvement that we might hope based on all of the enthusiasm we've seen over the last couple of years on these topics. So what I'm saying is we still have a lot of work to do. Why is that? Well, these same groups are often underrepresented among applicants to PA school. So even though they're close to 13% of the country, Black individuals make up only 7% of applicants to PA school, meaning we're not even getting enough people applying. And there's a lot of reasons for that that I won't burn too much of the time talking about, but representation is one of them. If you don't see people like you doing things, it's hard to imagine yourself doing those things. It's hard to have role models and mentors and community support and a clear path to achieving that goal. And so we see these drop-offs in the population to the applicant pool. And then we see drop-off again to the matriculants. These are people getting into PA school. So once we've sort of quote unquote weeded people out, and I use that term very like flippantly, but once we see this drop off of people even applying, we see another drop off of people getting in because the application process itself is expensive. It has biases. It's got all kinds of factors that make it harder if you have things working against you, including racial and ethnic bias. Okay, so to kind of summarize all of that, if we use Black Americans as an example, we see like 12.6% of the country is Black, 7.6% of the PA application pool is Black. So we're already losing a whole bunch of people in just, hey, we're here, the PA profession wants you, we're welcoming to you, we make it seem very feasible to apply and pursue this dream. And then we see another drop off down to 3.1% or 3% if you look at the most recent AAPA data of PAs that are actually in the profession as a population. I don't have a slide for this, but you should just know that 20 years ago, these numbers were not so small. In fact, this trend has been going in the wrong direction for over 2 decades. So we have a lot of work to do as a profession. Okay. Whew, that was another whirlwind, I know, but I wanted to cover a lot of ground so that we get back to this intersection. Let's make a little bit of a detour back into the toxic behavior stuff and talk about power gradients again, but I want you to keep in mind that basically, you know, that the PA profession is not alone in its diversity problems. There are a lot of the same issues amongst physicians, amongst other professionals. So when we think about power gradients, I want you to think about another power gradient that I didn't talk about yet, and that's the power gradient of the other, which basically means that if you're not like the people around you, you're at the bottom of a power gradient. What does that really look like? Well, if you look at the JAMA 2019 survey that asked residents across the country whether they get bullied or not, and then drilled down into what it was about the people that said, yes, they were getting bullied in the workplace, which is a really weird way to get bullied if you think about it. Like, it's super common. Like, I've been bullied in the workplace, but like, it's a really weird place to be abusing other people when you're all being paid to be there. Anyway, but you ask residents about bullying in the workplace, and these are the risk factors for being bullied. Non-English native language, meaning, I mean, they speak English, but it wasn't their first language. Being a graduate of a foreign medical school, or being a graduate of a foreign residency. So basically, if you're just an outsider in any way that's really obvious to people, the way you talk, or just things about you that are obvious to the eye or the ear, you're at increased risk of bullying because you're at this bottom of this other power gradient. There's a big study that just came out in the last couple of years. I'm happy to be able to update this, looking at the UK health system. And I know culturally, the UK is super different from us. Like, I mean, in a lot of ways, including bias and racism and racial and ethnic factors of all kinds. But they have a national healthcare system. So they do a really good job of gathering data. And they often survey people about their experiences in that national healthcare system, mostly because they have a big time retention problem. But they asked them, hey, who's getting bullied in the UK? They did this massive study and published a bunch of the data in different articles. But the short version is the people most likely to experience discrimination and harassment. I mean, this probably doesn't shock anybody, but women, people of a Black ethnic minority, which again, they're not African American, obviously, because they're not American, but there's a lot of different Black immigrant populations that end up in the UK. Migrants in general were more likely to be discriminated, and then nurses and nursing assistants, because of those traditional power gradients that I talked about earlier, they still around, they still matter. So these were the groups of people that were more likely to be bullied in the UK system. Okay, so this going back across our side of the Atlantic, this was a study done at Yale and basically looked at racial and gender discrimination and how that affects your mental health. We're here talking about burnout, we're talking about wellness, we're talking about our mental health, but how does the fact that we have a really poorly represented ethnic and racial minority population in our healthcare system affect the experiences of those people, and how does that affect their mental health? Well, racial discrimination in this study really was a good predictor of all of the symptoms that we care about, all of the things we already know affect our healthcare population and our consequences of toxic behavior. But racial discrimination in particular predicted symptoms of depression, anxiety, and PTSD among healthcare workers. This was all done kind of in that pandemic era, which is, we're sort of seeing the first groups of data coming out of that. So it's interesting to see when we really ratchet up the stress level of everyone, the people that are often most affected by it. We also saw gender discrimination predicting symptoms of PTSD and burnout in this same study. So this was a Yale study that was done, just published in the last couple of years. So it's some fresher data on a very evolving healthcare system. It's really hard to track over the last 5 years trends in anything because the last 5 years have been so crazy. But it's really telling that these types of discrimination in particular are affecting those health outcomes we care so much about, those mental health outcomes. All right. And then how about those really subtle things? I've talked a lot about how there's a spectrum of toxic behavior, but what about the most subtle things like microaggressions? And what if we look at a population of surgeons and anesthesiologists? The OR environment is sort of notorious for being a pressure cooker. So how does that come through in some of the most subtle ways that toxic behavior is expressed? Well, if you look at female physicians, 94% in this population. So these are female surgeons and anesthesiologists. These are tough individuals who have gone through a lot of training to get to the pinnacle of where they are in their career. 94% of them still said they were subject to microaggressions in the workplace. And then if you look at those of if you look at anyone of a racial or ethnic minority group, those physicians, 81% of them said that they had racial or ethnic microaggressions, directed towards them or in their presence. Now, of course, these groups are not mutually exclusive. There's women who are physicians who are of racial and ethnic minority groups. And so those people, you can imagine, have a much higher intersection of both of these. And then both groups are also more likely to report burnout independent of those, those other factors. So basically what we have is even these really, really subtle forms of toxic behavior leading or at least being highly associated with burnout. I can't really say causation because that's not how these studies are built. You can't say causation off of survey data, but certainly seems like that relationship probably goes in one direction. Okay, your students or soon to be students or just were students, so what does that mean for you? I know this is probably not what you want to hear, but students actually are treated pretty well in the grand scheme of things. It doesn't mean that your life is perfect. It doesn't mean you're not under stress. You absolutely are. But luckily, I think this is good news, and I would have expected this, that you're not quite abused at the same rates as some of us out there in the workforce for years and years, thankfully. But students still report discrimination and harassment. That's important to know. We still have an obligation to do something about this. That's also important to know. And it's interesting to see that some of those same factors that make everyone else vulnerable to toxic behavior are reported by PA students as well. So if you break it down, you'll see that PA students are reporting discrimination and harassment mostly based on gender. So I'm assuming that's bias against women, although it could technically be bias against men, but I don't think that's really what that is. You see pretty good percentages of, and I say good isn't pretty high percentages of people that are personally experiencing, but also witnessing this behavior. And remember, I told you witnesses tend to suffer similar consequences. We also see the next most popular, if you will, form of discrimination or harassment was amongst racial or ethnicity, was because of racial or ethnic factors. And then we see religion also making the list there. You can imagine that some religions are more obvious to the eye. Obviously, many of us are not walking around discussing our religious beliefs every day, but some people have, whether it's attire or other things about them that make their religion more obvious. That can certainly be a form of discrimination. And then sexual orientation and sexuality is also on the list there. So you'll see that these are things that students are reporting, and these are things like denied opportunities, offensive remarks, sometimes even lower evaluations or grades or comments on their formal evaluations, which can be harmful to your career, but let alone your mental health. Okay, so I've really thrown a lot at you here. Basically, what we need to recap is just that the intersection of these three topics: toxic behavior is super harmful to clinicians and their patients. We have marginalized groups that are underrepresented in the healthcare professions, and specifically in the PA profession. So people that are traditionally marginalized in the United States are also underrepresented in some of the best professions out there, some of the most prosperous, and some of the places where you can have a huge impact on your world around you. And that's important because those that are here in smaller numbers. They are more likely to be in that other category at the bottom of power gradients and subjected to toxic behavior and more vulnerable to its consequences, because there's just more varying types of toxic behavior you can subject somebody to when they are in the minority, when they are from a marginalized group, and when you can use things like their race or their ethnicity or their religion or their sexuality against them and weaponize those things. So that's all pretty depressing, and it's probably just making you really feel terrible about healthcare. But I want you to know some things. You can make a difference in this. It's not your obligation to, but I just want you to think about your role in healthcare as a healthcare professional going forward. We can fix this. We can improve this. We can make this place a lot better. And I really want people who have those underlying principles of justice and equity, who feel like there's a moral imperative to make the world good for the people around us. I really want you in the healthcare profession if you feel that way. But I also want you to talk about your power a little bit. I know that right now you're either a PA student, a brand new grad, or maybe about to be a PA student or want to be a PA student. You may be at the lowest point in your power in healthcare. But notice I didn't say you're powerless. Your power is going to roll out in phases. You have some power now, and you'll have more power in the future. And here's how your power works. So first and foremost, you should know that you are about to be, or are, or will soon be, the biggest class of graduating PA students that has ever existed. There's more PA programs now than there ever were, and the class size can only increase over time. So we have more PA students graduating now, meaning that you are coming out with the largest social presence of any graduating group ever. And you will continue to have class after class after class that's larger and larger come behind you. You have a presence in healthcare. It's important for you to be deliberate in how you feel about that social presence, how you project that social presence, and how you use social pressure to help improve the world around you. That doesn't mean you have to come in and crusade at your first job and be the most vocal and throw elbows out and make as much noise as possible, because I know, practically speaking, that's not easy to do. I've been doing this 10 years. I still don't do that. I still walk in and take stock of the situation first. I still know that if I'm the loudest person in the room, it doesn't necessarily make me the most effective. But what we can do is be very visible. If you're from a marginalized group, being present and being visible is super important. But if all you are is an ally to the people in those marginalized groups, that's super important too. Those numbers, I didn't really highlight it, but hey, we're mostly a white profession out here, which means white people have to do a lot to improve the situation around us too. But that means we need to make this whole place a lot more equitable as well, which means being vocal in our allyship and calling out terrible behavior when we see it, whether that's directly, if we have the opportunity to do that and aren't going to be facing backlash, or whether that's indirectly, making it known that in these places, we really care about the consequences. We really care about the culture. We really care how people are treated. Remember, I told you that power gradients are really important, and social capital is a power gradient. So even being numerous, even if you're not in the most elevated position of power, can be really important. Knowing that, hey, that kind of stuff just doesn't fly around here will stop a lot of bad behavior in its tracks. The next phase, though, is you're going to get more experienced. You're going to get older. You're going to become the experienced people around the unit. That's going to give you an opportunity to put things in a position of formal and informal leadership. Formal means you may have a position as a team lead, you may be an administrator, you may be a PA program director, and have formal leadership opportunities. But you may also just be the experienced person on the unit, the people in the clinic that everyone looks up to, the person that has the opportunity to informally or formally mentor someone else. So you're going to start projecting beyond your own personal influence and influence others. It's important to do that really deliberately. And honestly, the passage of time is all that it might take for you to really move into those roles. So don't shy away from that. If you feel particularly called to leadership, embrace it. And even if you don't remember that someone is looking up to you at all times, the way you model behavior is going to be extremely important. And then time will keep passing. And I want you to think about something that I like to call the Jurassic Park principle. Someone once said that progress happens one funeral at a time. It means that the most oldest and outdated mindsets will go away. They'll retire or they'll go off to a farm somewhere. Eventually, we will be the old people with the gray hair. I've already got some in my beard. It's really distressing. But eventually, we'll all have gray hair somewhere, and these older ideas will start to die out. It's very important that we don't bring back the dinosaurs. It's very important that we stand by our principles and that we continue to make progress and continue to improve the environment around us, that we don't model the terrible behavior we saw modeled for us, and that we do better than the people who came before us. We don't need to bring back those awful ideas. We don't need to bring back those awful habits. We don't need to continue to prop up institutions that support bad behavior. So these are really important things that we can do over time. It's going to take years. I know I talk to a lot of people who want to change the world tomorrow. And if you can do it, do it. But the truth is, most of us us, it's going to take our entire careers to see real progress. And that's okay, because there's a whole bunch of people coming behind us. Okay, so I'll leave it there. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today. That's my handle on social media. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Instagram. I can give you all my email address too. I just didn't have it in there. I'll put it in the chat. So please reach out if this resonated with you, if I can help you in any way. I really appreciate the opportunity. I know this is a really engaged group of people, so I appreciate it. I don't know if we have time for questions because I feel like I talked forever, but if so, I'm happy to. And I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Harrison.
I would just say, in the interest of time, to respect everybody's time, I think we should move on. If you have any questions specifically for Harrison, you can, he said he would put his email in the chat, and then his Instagram handle is also on there in the chat.
Thank you.
Okay, so next on the table is the PAC